Let's talk about the conditions for a nose that can be a huge success with filler procedures. First, the skin of the nose. It can be thick or thin, right? So which one is better? In most cases like this, having thin skin is generally more advantageous. Because if you think of the skin as being too thick, like in the case of a bulbous nose even, if you open up the skin, tidy up the internal structures, and shape and raise the cartilage nicely, if the skin is too thick, the changes won't really show on the outside. So having thinner skin is more advantageous than having thick skin. But there's another thing to consider here. Some people actually have skin that's too thin. If your nasal bridge or tip already has a certain height, it's not a problem. But if you need to raise the bridge or tip significantly, you'll be using things like silicone or cartilage at the tip. In that case, these materials can end up showing through the skin. So when the skin is too thin, like this, there are specific points you need to be careful about. Therefore, while thinner skin is generally better than thick skin, you still need to pay attention to these aspects during surgery. I hope you keep this in mind. Sometimes, if the skin is extremely thin, using silicone can feel too risky. So we end up not using it at all. First of all, I think that's about it for organizing the information about the skin of the nose. Now, let me talk about size. There are cases where the nose is large and cases where it is small. Generally, having a larger nose is usually more advantageous than having a smaller one. For example, if the nose is small and short, you need to both lower and raise the tip. But there might not be enough extra skin. In that case, no matter how much you want to raise it, there are limits. In situations like this, it's naturally more difficult to achieve good surgical results. The most extreme case of this is what's called a contracted nose. When the nose is not only short and upturned, but also hardened, it's naturally very difficult to bring it forward and raise it, right? So if the size is small, it's naturally a bit disadvantageous. But if the size is large, let's say, for example, you have a hump on your nose and the tip is drooping down like this, then the skin on your nose has a lot of excess. In that case, if you trim down the hump and lift the tip nicely, the results can be dramatically improved. Especially for us, we often perform surgeries without implants. And if there's a hump, since the nasal bridge is somewhat prominent, it's actually advantageous for non-implant procedures. So having a larger nose can be beneficial in this way. However, just as having thin skin can be advantageous but also requires caution, having a large nose isn't always entirely a good thing either. What I mean is, if the nose is extremely large with a big nasal bone, wide nostrils, and on top of that it's a bulbous nose that's also high, it can be quite tricky to make it smaller. No matter how much you try to reduce it, it's already just too big. And if the nose is bulbous but low, you can make it look slimmer by raising it a bit. But if it's already high and bulbous, that's a different story. In that case, there can actually be some limitations when it comes to planning or calculating what to do. So if the nose is not only very large, but also has thick skin, this kind of situation can actually be less favorable. Lastly, we need to look at the facial bone structure. To exaggerate a bit, imagine the face is shaped like a semicircle and the nose is positioned like this. In other words, the chin is receded and the forehead is slanted backward. In this case, the higher you make the nose, the more unnatural it will look. On the other hand, in this case, this is the nose, and the area between the eyes is indented like this. So even if you exaggerate and raise the bridge of the nose, you can make it this high. You can raise it like this and have it go up like this, right? Since the forehead and chin are well defined, among men, there are some whose brow bones are prominent, and the area between the eyebrows and the nose is deeply indented. For those people, if you fill in this area well, their impression really improves dramatically. Becomes much clearer and more defined. To add a bit more, in the past, when costal cartilage wasn't commonly used, it was naturally known that people with a larger septal cartilage or similar features would have better surgical outcomes. But nowadays, since we often use materials like donated rib cartilage or autologous rib cartilage, even if the septal cartilage is small, we can cover it with those types of cartilage. So the size of the cartilage you have, whether it's big or small, doesn't really matter all that much anymore.